life isn't a dress rehearsal, that how I use this week is something that matters in life.
That was Oliver Burkeman on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 3 clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and co-author of ACT Daily Journal.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the upcoming book, Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from sunny San Diego, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty and the Big Book of ACT Metaphors.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Psychologists Off the Clock is proud to be partnered with Praxis Continuing Education. Praxis is the premier provider of evidence-based training for mental health professionals. Praxis offers both live and on-demand courses with options for beginner as well as more advanced clinicians. Praxis is also known for its top acceptance and commitment therapy trainers. So if you're a clinician and you want to level up your ACT skills, Praxis is the place. And if you're like us at Psychologists Off the Clock and you want to transform your clients' lives by learning how to effectively promote lasting change with evidence-based training, check out Praxis Continuing Education. You can get a coupon code on the offers page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com/sponsors.
Hi, this is Debbie, and Yael and I are here today. We co-interviewed Oliver Burkeman. He's the author of a few books, and we interviewed him about his book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, because we both loved this book so much. We just kind of had to do it together. And one of the things that happened with this interview, I grapple with time management. I have the podcast on top of my, my day job as a therapist and other things that I do. And I'm a parent. So this morning, the interview happened pretty early for me here in Denver because of time zone differences. And I couldn't find my headphones, which were missing from where they normally are. And I was in this big tizzy trying to get myself going without headphones and scrambling around trying to figure out something, which, by the way, I don't know if my audio is, if you can tell or not, but it might not be quite as good because I had to improvise. But one of the reasons that happened is because yesterday I took my daughter skiing. I had actually a pretty light day, but I was going to catch up on everything and get ready for this interview. And I had a bunch of other things I was planning to work on. And I just really needed that time to get, because I had a light clinical load, to get some things done. And it was really important to me to have this time with my daughter. We played hooky and we went up together and we, just spent a few hours skiing and we had fun together. And it felt important to me for a number of reasons to do that right now. And it was just an interesting timing to be talking with Oliver about his work on being intentional with time and how we only have so much of it. And often the important things get lost in the shuffle.
Yes. And that was such a great example, Debbie, of making a choice about using your time with eyes open, but also not getting to avoid the costs of that. There's always opportunity costs when we choose to use our time in one way and not another. The heart of the book is that we can't do it all. We don't have all the time in the world. And so yesterday, when you made a choice to play hooky and go skiing, that gave you a lot and it was values consistent, but it also meant that you weren't clearing the deck on other things that felt important or that were going to kind of come back and haunt you the next day. But that doesn't mean it was the wrong choice. It was just a choice like any other, which has benefits and has costs. And I think that is where values really fit in, that you were clear on your values and that you can accept that that also might have other things to deal with in the long run.
And one of the things I think that any listeners will get out of this interview is just that very high level perspective, right? Like really zooming out and thinking big picture. This isn't going to be like, oh, here's 5 steps for how to be really efficient or give you a very concrete time management system that you can use, but rather it's going to help you look at the big picture of your life and how you're losing your time. But there are a few concrete strategies in there as well, I think, from what Oliver does in his own life and that kind of thing. But I also think it's really more of a perspective shift.
Yeah, and some of the concrete things are really attached to the perspective shift. So for example, he talks about the amount of time that he spends on work, which is actually less than you might expect, but he does it very deliberately and focused, kind of a deep work kind of approach, and then really takes a very flexible approach to the rest of his day. And I think some of those tips, as well as the tips around building patience and the value of building patience in a world that is so impatient, are just really helpful. So the high-level ideas of accepting our finitude, of realizing that we're always making choices and that we can't do it all, help lead to some of these concrete choices that we each can make day to day, and hopefully in a value-aligned way. And that when we do that, we feel less encumbered by the limitations of time and more present in what is. We can be more inside of the process as opposed to panicking that we're not getting to the outcome that we're looking for. And that fits in, Debbie, to the work that you and I do. You're writing a book about burnout in work, and I'm writing a book about working parenthood. And so I think this is something that we'll continue to talk about in future episodes around our work, and hopefully have guests that bring in some of these similar ideas to Oliver Burkeman around acceptance of mortality, making value-aligned choices, and figuring out how to engage in the roles that are most important to us in the most effective ways possible. Debbie and I are here today with Oliver Burkeman, who's a journalist and the author of several terrific books, including The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, which is one of my favorite titles. And he has a new book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. Also another great title. You have a knack for good titles, Oliver. This new book is about making the most of our finite lives in a world of impossible demands, relentless distraction, and productivity techniques that mainly just make everyone feel busier. So we're really excited to have him here to talk about this very, very important topic. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, we rarely have two co-hosts interview an author on this podcast, but it turns out that we were both vying for president of the Oliver Burkeman fan club and decided that neither of us could miss out on this amazing opportunity, which ironically goes very much against your advice of finding the joy in missing out. So I thought that might be a fun place to start, because you talk about a hard reality that nobody wants to confront, which is that we will miss out on things, but you recommend embracing limits and hard choices. So I wonder if you can sort of start us off by talking about this idea of approaching and being open to neglecting things and actually finding joy in doing so, even when, as you know, many of us want to, like Kafka wrote, live more than one life.
Right. Oh, and me too. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's useful here probably just to begin by making this general point that what I think I'm trying to do in this book, or I see myself trying to do, is point out certain things that just are already true, and that we go to quite great lengths to sort of avoid confronting and feeling fully in ourselves, as opposed to suggesting that people change what's true, right? So it's not about going from a life where you don't miss out on things to a life where you do. It's about seeing that you already are inevitably missing out on most things by virtue of being a finite human in a world of effectively infinite possibilities, obligations, opportunities, demands. And so the solace and the extra sense of meaning comes from sort of stepping more authentically into the situation that you're already in, as it were. Seeing that, since missing out is completely inevitable, since every decision to commit to any project or relationship or anything like that is by definition a decision to repudiate the other ones, at least for now. And that since you don't have any choice in that matter, if you do it more consciously, firstly, you make wiser decisions because you're no longer kidding yourself that you're not making tough choices. And then secondly, there's a kind of a sense of affirmation in doing that, right? There's a sense of really having chosen it. So if I think something's wrong with my life because I have to choose between spending time with my 5-year-old son and doing some work project that I'm excited by, then I'm constantly going to be trying to find ways to I'm not going to be fully present with each of these things. I'm going to be thinking that some time is coming in the future when these things are not going to have to be traded off against each other. And it's going to be very stressful and less fulfilling. But if I see that, like, that's just how it is, right? I could use this hour for one thing, or I could use it for the other. Then almost whichever I choose, not always my choice, of course, when it comes to looking after kids, is it? But by seeing that I had to choose, the choice is sort of imbued with meaning. It's easier to be present in that choice and to sort of not feel that terrible sense of like, oh, should I be doing something different? Because on one level, the answer to that question is always yes. Like, yeah, there are 1,000 useful, valuable, important things you could be doing now. So yeah, you could be doing something different, but that's okay.
I love that example of the tension between work and family roles, because I do think there's this myth in our culture that if you have a conflict between two roles, it's something to solve. And what you write about and what you're saying here now is that if we sort of accept that as the reality as opposed to fighting it, then we can make more deliberate choices and feel better about whatever we choose, knowing that we're choosing one thing and therefore not choosing the other, but that there's no alternative. You kind of have to.
Right, absolutely. And it's like, yes, there are all these kind of ideas. Work-life balance is one of my particular least favorites that imply that some sort of final reconciliation ought to be possible between those kinds of clashing roles. But what if it's always going to be the case that, if you, I mean, I think if I wasn't constrained by the human condition in the ways that I am, I would love to give even more time than I do to being a present parent. I would also love to spend, 10 hours a day reading into whole new areas of philosophy, and another 10 hours a day hiking in the hills here near where we live. And, very quickly I'm at way more than 24 hours, and plus I need to sleep. So that would be great, but it's not a realistic assessment of where we are. And so you're only going to add to your sense of stress and your second guessing of yourself if you think that it's a problem that situation exists. So it's another example of this idea of like treating life as some kind of problem to be solved, which I think probably runs through a lot of what I'm writing.
Well, one of the ways that I think you make this point really well in the book, and it's even embedded into your title, is by giving us this dose of reality that our time is finite, right? That we're mortals. And I mean, newsflash, we're all going to die eventually, right? And I think sometimes we don't want to think about that, but actually thinking about that can really give us some perspective taking when it comes to how we use our time and time management. So, Oliver, why do you think it's important to tap into that sense of mortality if you're really going to be deliberate about time?
I mean, as you say, with your sort of jokingly using the word newsflash, this isn't something that people don't realize, mainly. Maybe some people don't realize, but it's something that we don't sort of internalize and face up to in the way that we could. So we know that we're going to die. We know our time is finite, but we sort of act. And this, Seneca, the Roman Stoic, made this observation. This is old, but we sort of act as if we were immortal, even while knowing and feeling sort of haunted by the fact that we're not. So we go through our days as if we had all the time in the world. I don't think that it's necessarily about sort of thinking a lot about death and dying. I haven't, there's a role for that. I write about that a little bit in the earlier book, but it's more just to do with this ramification of dying. It's a consequence, one of the consequences of the fact that we die, which is that our time is finite, that you can't constantly put off the meaningful parts of your life into the future, because at a certain point the future will run out. And so the useful thing about sort of stepping more fully into this realization is not, I think, that you go around all day thinking about death, but that you just sort of see the stakes from minute to minute a little bit more clearly. So you see that, like, actually how you use an hour is an important question. And you see that telling yourself that at some point you're going to get everything in working order so that you can do everything is an illusion. And I don't think this needs to be a stressful recipe for like, oh my goodness, am I making the most out of life? That's the other thing I'm always at pains to sort of push back against. I think it's liberating and relaxing because you get to say, well, okay, certain things are not possible for me as a human, like pleasing every single person, fulfilling every single ambition that occurs to me, answering every single email somebody might conceivably send me, fulfilling every social pressure that I feel from the society, right? Doing all that is off the table. So now I just get to have a bit more agency in choosing which handful of those things I'm going to focus on.
I think you're bringing up something really important that you write about in the chapter about cosmic insignificance therapy, that there's this paradox of when you recognize that life is finite and that you can't accomplish all that you want to, that instead of making you depressed, it can actually be helpful. And in fact, you offer an invitation to pursue a modestly significant life. And so I wonder if you can, and I'll just read a quote from your book that I thought was terrific. But the idea is that this kind of treatment can help you drop back down from godlike fantasies of cosmic significance into the experience of life as it is, concretely, finitely, and often enough, marvelously really is. This is kind of like a mind-blowing idea, that recognizing that we might live a fairly insignificant life can actually be helpful. So can you talk us through that idea?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways into this. One of them is just to say, like, it's that familiar reminder when it comes to a big decision that's sort of churning you up inside, that, ask yourself who's going to care which way you decide in 100 years, or frankly, even in 24 hours quite often, right? There's some freedom in sort of just lowering the stakes, and it actually can free you up not to, live a life of despair, but to take bold choices, make risky decisions, because actually the stakes are lower than you thought. And I guess to get a bit more profound or something with it, there is this idea that we go about with some very unhelpful definitions, I think, in our minds of what counts as a meaningful life and what counts as fulfilling our potential. And, that may be for some people becoming very famous and successful and huge professional success. And there have been, that's important. And I don't want to put that, to suggest that it isn't. But at the same time, I don't think you'd want a definition of meaningful activity in life that left all these other things that we do in our lives, cook nutritious meals for our children, or, keep some small part of our neighborhood looking more beautiful than it otherwise might, or care for an elderly relative, or I don't know, a million things like this that we just instinctively we know are part of a meaningful way to spend our time on the planet, but that probably don't meet this criterion of, like, you've got to put a dent in the universe, to quote Steve Jobs, or you've got to do something that is really extraordinary or unusual. So I think it's just important to work with a definition of a meaningful life that is fitted to our scale as humans, because otherwise, maybe Shakespeare and Einstein get to have meaningful lives, maybe even Steve Jobs, but then the rest of us have no hope.
Right. And these ideas all fit in with the kind of therapy that Debbie and Jill and I do, acceptance and commitment therapy, which you talk about in The Antidote. I believe you interviewed Steve Hayes, right?
I wrote about him, yes. We had a little communication, and then I wrote about his use of the Chinese finger trap to demonstrate the idea that sometimes trying too hard to change your emotions is a surefire way to make yourself feel worse. Right.
And I mean, it's sort of interesting how similar some of the recommendations for happiness are to recommendations for time management. It's sort of like accepting the reality, leaning into the discomfort is actually the most freeing thing that you can do. And that's one of the core processes in acceptance and commitment therapy is acceptance. And I think the way that you write about it is so eye-opening, I think, for people outside of the field of psychology. So, I think that is a tip of accepting the uncomfortable realities rather than trying to run away from them or solve them when they can't be solved because they're so fundamental to human existence is such a powerful truth. It's an ancient truth. It's a modern truth. But, what laboratory science and social scientists have discovered is that when we kind of open up to those uncomfortable truths, they're not as restrictive. They're not as terrifying. And so I think that's a big take home from your writing.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that, and I don't know enough about acceptance and commitment therapy to sort of say much more. But I do think that, I guess I see it as occupying some, or seeking to occupy some space between sort of cognitive behavioral therapy with its intense focus on interventions and change, and then psychodynamic therapy with its focus on understanding and insight, and maybe also just sort of reconciling yourself to the human situation. So I sort of appreciate that in it, because I think that's that sort of ground where it's not just a question of seeing how things are, but also not just a question of fixing what you imagine to be your problems is really powerful. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of that discomfort and avoidance, I would say that sometimes there can be almost an addictive quality to being busy, or to this fast-paced living that we all get into, where we have all these tasks to do and we're constantly busy. And I can relate to that in my own life, right? Sometimes it feels very, I don't know, I get a little jolt of dopamine or something when I'm just checking things off my to-do list. But I think there's some costs of that. And so I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about that cycle. Why do we get into that cycle of just productivity and efficiency and busyness? And what do you think are the costs of that?
Yeah. So my hunch that I sort of pursue in the book, in the most recent book, is that a lot of the ways in which we think we are trying to be good and diligent and productive are best understood probably as forms of emotional avoidance, ways of trying to not feel the impact of our limitations, of the fact that we're always having to make tough choices about our limited time, so that, and partly this is me talking about my own journey, so it might not be a universal thing, but I think that that sense that you're building systems and disciplining yourself to become more and more efficient, so that at some point in the future, because you never quite arrive at it, do you? You're going to get to this place where you are just effortlessly optimized and handling everything that can be thrown at you, realizing your potential, meeting your obligations. That's performing seems to me a very obvious and useful, but ultimately detrimental psychological job, which is it's helping you feel like, okay, I don't have to actually confront the fact that this is it, that life isn't a dress rehearsal, that how I use this week is something that matters in life. Makes it all provisional and waiting for this moment when you're sort of fully optimized and productive. And, if that didn't get in the way of leading a meaningful life, then maybe there would be no problem with that. I'm not sure. I think that there's something intrinsically good about confronting reality, but there's something very practically good, which is that sort of treadmill of productivity. Firstly, it causes you to sort of generally to sort of focus entirely on the future, and to put the meaning of life in this kind of like, when I finally get through this stuff, and it turns everything you're doing now into something you have to kind of get through to get to something good, rather than something that could be good in itself. And then there are all these phenomena to do with Parkinson's law and what I call the efficiency trap, right? Which is how actually getting more efficient at things like email or life admin, beyond a certain point anyway, will just generate more email and more admin. So it's not even an effective way of getting through those things, because the supply is effectively infinite. So going faster just means you do more and feel busier, but you don't get any closer to getting to the end of it.
Well, and I want to jump in with an example of my own that's related to your book, because when I was ready to order your new book, it was out of stock. It was so popular. You've done a marvelous job.
Tell me about it. The supply chain crisis has hit me as well as the whole of American industry. Yeah.
Well, it's the supply chain, but also I think people are really hungry for this kind of conversation. So it was out of stock when I wanted to order it. So I ended up listening to it on Audible, and I love Audible books because it helps me to multitask. I can consume books, which I love. My husband is always telling me, you're not reading, you're consuming. And I'm sometimes half consuming because I'm distracted. And I admit that. But but it feels really good, as Debbie was saying. You know, there's sort of like that. I'm getting things done.
Yeah.
And I will admit too that I listen to my Audible books set at 1.2 times speed
Right,
because it's very efficient.
Yeah.
And as I'm listening to it, I'm also, you are the one reading it, which is lovely. And you're sort of recommending patience and slowing down. And so I was thinking about this concept of patience as I'm listening to your book at 1.2 times speed while I'm doing my morning runs. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of the history of this virtue of patience and why it's really gone off trend and what the costs are to us.
Yeah, sure. I want to give due credit here to Jennifer Roberts, who's an art historian at Harvard, who I write about in the book and who really switched me onto this way of thinking about patience. Briefly, in terms of my thesis, I think that impatience is generally an attempt to sort of get the world to go as fast as you think it should, and frustration at the fact that it won't. And that's all connected to this idea of our limitations and the fact that we don't get to dictate reality in the way that we wish. That there are, one of the limitations we have is that certain things take the time that they take. But Jennifer Roberts points out that, you know, historically, patience seems like a very passive kind of virtue. So you imagine sort of, young Victorian women being told about the necessity to be patient because they were meant to, you know, stay home, and it was the men who were living the engaged lives in the public sphere. Or you think about how patience could be abused in a million different ways to tell people or groups that, like, for now they just have to deal with the fact that they lack privileges or they lack control, and it's sort of a way of reconciling yourself to lacking control in society. But Roberts makes this brilliant point, I think, that as society accelerates and as we become completely geared towards doing everything as fast as we possibly can, the capacity to be patient in lots of contexts is actually a sort of form of agency or of a self-assertion or even of control. It's not something you do to sort of make it more tolerable to be a doormat. It's something you do to actually kind of, I don't know, gain a professional edge apart from anything else. Because if everything is moving so fast, and yet certain things just require a certain amount of time, reading, thinking, creative work, all these kind of things where so many of us are seeking to make our living, it's really beneficial to not just succumb to the social pressure to go as fast as you can and to be able to feel the discomfort that comes from letting things take the time they take, which is why Jennifer Roberts asks all her incoming students to do this exercise where they have to find a painting or a sculpture and go and look at it for 3 hours straight. And why I did that too when I went to interview her and chose a painting in the Harvard Art Museums and just sat in front of it for 3 hours. Just as an example of this, right? There's immense discomfort associated with this. You feel incredibly impatient and antsy because, like, you're just not used to being dictated, or I'm not used to having the tempo of life dictated to me in the way that this rule was doing, that, you know, you had to be there for 3 hours. But on the other hand, you literally, I don't mean metaphorically, I mean literally see things in a painting once you've looked at it for an hour or so that you did not see before that moment, right? The experience is completely different because actually, as it turns out, a good painting has things in it that repay that kind of patience. And I think that generalizes. I don't think it's just about art appreciation. I think it is most definitely, for example, about parenting small children.
I was just going to say that. I was going to say, have you applied that to parenting your small child? Because I think that is another area where we don't get to dictate how quickly things go. And when we push, we miss out. And when we slow down and allow our children to have some say in how long things take, we sometimes learn a lot more about them, their texture, their depth.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like any parent, I'm sure these days of a 5-year-old, I find myself thinking like, oh no, like you can't stay focused on something for more than 5 minutes without wanting to do something different. Is this like modern technology? Is there too much screen time in this house? And then this literally happened to me a couple of days ago. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this thing everyone always says I should do, and just be like, let's just really, I've got 3 hours now. Let's just make it like your choice. What do What are we going to do? I'll make like a few rules about spending money and eating all the unhealthy food in the cupboard or whatever. But apart from that, like, you get to choose, and I'm going to be there and enter into it. I didn't say it in these terms to 5-year-old, but you know what I mean. Unless you want to do it on your own, which is fine. And then instantly we're involved in an imaginative play that lasts literally an hour and a half, right? That there's no sense of a short attention span or anything like that, just because actually what kids want from us, I think, so often is just to enter as fully as we can into their experience. And so, maybe the reason that he doesn't want to draw a picture on his own for more than 5 minutes is because he's well aware that I'm at the other end of the kitchen, like, distracted, trying to do something else. It's like I'm not there as much as I could or should be. And as soon as you are, which involves the willingness to sort of let the thing unfold at its own pace, suddenly all these things that I think are wrong with, I don't know, my parenting or how I'm raising my son, they're not there. It's just because I, generally speaking, am wanting things to go on my agenda too much.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I don't know.
That makes so much sense. And you offer these 3 principles of patience, and I wonder if you can share what they are, because they're such great practices and ways to think about patience in a helpful way.
So the first one is what I phrase as developing a taste for having problems. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is just this sense that part of what's happening when we're sort of impatiently racing through life is not just that we want to get through specific things, although that's certainly the case with some unpleasant chores or distressing experiences, but we're actually we've got some unarticulated fantasy that we're trying to race through to some point where we don't have problems at all. I think a lot of us, I'm speaking from experience, but I know it's not just me, sort of have this double objection to the problems in our lives. Like, firstly, you've got a problem you've got to solve. And then secondly, you're kind of affronted on some level that you even have to deal with problems in your life. And you forget that actually, if you're employed in a job where you use your brain, big part of why you've got that job is precisely because you've got some aptitude for solving the unexpected problems. If it was all plain sailing, it could probably be done by a robot. But solving the problems is the thing that human ingenuity is required for. And so it's just very, very liberating in a way to realize that you're never going to get to a point in life where there are no problems, and that you actually wouldn't want to, because what is a problem? It's just like a challenging thing to which you have to apply yourself, and that has some value to you, that means something to you. That's just the substance of life. It's not something to be got rid of. Obviously, there are particular bad problems that I wouldn't wish on anyone and that you probably do want to get rid of. But this notion that there's a golden age of no problems coming, I think, makes people even more impatient about the ones that they have in the moment. The other 2 rules, one is to embrace radical incrementalism, this idea that actually there's an enormous amount of power in being able to work for just a small period of time, but day after day after day on a project, for being willing to make progress slowly. And what you can actually get in return for that is much more, and even in a sense, faster progress, right? Than if you try to make progress in huge binges and then you're exhausted for weeks and don't do anything more on it. Or if you build projects up in your life to such a large picture in your mind that they're too intimidating to actually get around to, and you procrastinate on them. The third one is about originality and unoriginality. And there's a very long story here that I won't go into unless you ask me to. But the end result of it is just this notion, especially in creative work, that you sometimes have to be, and I think maybe it applies to relationships and things like that as well, you sometimes have to be patient to get through a period of learning at the beginning of something like this that feels, where it feels like you're not really doing something original if it's creative work, or you're not really getting into the really deepest part of it if it's a relationship or an activity that to which that would apply. And that actually there's patience involved in just sort of being willing to feel that for the time being you're doing something the same as everyone else. That you're not being sufficiently extraordinary in your life or something in order to get to the more extraordinary parts of those seemingly ordinary experiences.
Well, I would welcome you to share the story, because I think that this is a part of how we get into the creative process, and it's important that patience is a part of that. Yeah.
With the curse word or without the curse word?
go for it.
I don't know what kind of podcast this is. I mean, you can always edit it out. So this is a story that the Finnish American photographer Arno Minkkinen tells, and he's told it to his sort of graduating photography students. And so this is with reference to developing a career as a photographer, but I think it applies much more widely. He uses the analogy of the Helsinki central bus station, where all sorts of bus routes start from the same platforms, and then they follow the same. They stop at the same stops for quite a few stops while they're still within the city limits of Helsinki. And he says that if you think about each bus stop as a year of your career, what often happens to people is they will sort of take some photos, they'll develop a portfolio, they'll take it to a gallery, and they'll be told that it's very derivative. It's really similar to some established photographer, and they get very depressed. It's like, my bus was on the same route as this photographer, so I've got to go back to the central bus station and choose a new route. So they do it again, choose a new route. Same thing happens. They find out that actually the route they were on is the same one, stopping at the same places as this famous photographer who's gone before them. And it can go on and on and on. You sort of waste your professional life constantly trying to be original and always finding that you're not. And Minkkinen asks the question, what's the solution? And the solution is to stay on the fucking bus. Because the point is that, or to stay on the bus, if you need a different bit of audio that doesn't involve that word. Because it's after those initial stops. I hope this analogy is holding. It's after those initial stops that the bus routes begin to open off and to go into unique individual destinations around the suburbs and the countryside outlying Helsinki. The mistake you made was thinking that because you weren't going on a completely original path at the beginning, that you were destined to be on an unoriginal path. Actually, it was having the patience to stay on that unoriginal path for a few stops that is how you get to the bit where you really truly begin to feel like you're doing your own thing. There's a related idea that in a very famous bit of quotation from Ira Glass, the radio producer, This American Life creator, about how it often depresses people starting off early in radio, that because their tastes are so refined, but their skills are still being formed, they think that what they're producing is terrible rubbish. But it's actually because they are already connoisseurs and they are seeing their own product for the beginner product that it is. But it's not because they're bad. It's actually because they have real taste and that their abilities don't yet match up to their taste.
Wow, I can relate to that with podcasting, Yael. We're tough on ourselves because even though we're amateurs at this, we have high standards, I think.
Yeah. And the science on this is so interesting because it reminds me a lot of the work on grit or mindset, that it's sort of like we think that natural talent should breed creativity, but there's almost like no such thing as natural talent. It's effort and persistence and sticking with it, which all comes down to patience. And yet, because we absorb these things and we don't see the effort that goes into it, we just see the outcome.
Right.
And so we compare ourselves from wherever we are earlier on in our bus route to the outcome that other people have. And it feels like, we'll never get there because we don't have a deep understanding of how long it took the person who were witnessing their excellence to have gotten there.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, I always think about this, it's actually a lovely thing about the sort of digital era, that there's a very one-sided or a lopsided way that this works, right? If you putting out a podcast and it's great, then it picks up listeners and it spreads far and wide and people love what you do. If you put out a podcast that's no good because you're still learning, you don't get, generally speaking, you don't get publicly humiliated and do huge damage to your reputation. It just doesn't get noticed by anybody. If I put out an idea on my email newsletter, on Twitter or online or something that catches fire with people, that's wonderful. If it doesn't, just doesn't really get seen by anybody. So there's actually even less reason to feel paralyzed by this than there used to be. When, maybe if you're doing this for an old-fashioned kind of newspaper or something, there is more at stake if you put something out in there that's uninspiring. The there's even less reason to worry about this. Do things, put them out there. Realistically, the worst that is going to happen at scale anyway is that they're going to vanish without trace while you make some more until you get better. And so this notion that like everything is riding on you already being perfect at it is really, it's unnecessary. Yeah.
If you're looking for a great way to support us here at Psychologists Off the Clock and make your life easier and healthier, you should go to my new favorite online store, Thrive Market. Thrive Market carries all your grocery and household essentials with the convenience of getting everything online and then quickly shipped right to your door. And right now, you can get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift if you go to thrivemarket.com/POTC. I love that I can use specific filters to curate my shopping experience so I can find organic meats and low sugar snacks for my kids. Plus, when you join, they give to a family in need. How cool is that? So join in on the savings with Thrive Market today and get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. Go to thrivemarket.com/POTC for 30% off plus a free $60 gift. That's THRIVE market.com/POTC. thrivemarket.com/POTC.
I know I talk about my kids a lot, but I also have two adorable dogs, Tilly and Hazel. We love to spoil them, which is why we love Whole Life Pet. Whole Life Pet makes single ingredient treats, meal mixers, supplements, and hydrating snacks for both dogs and cats. And if you try out Whole Life Pet, you're surprising your pets with fun new flavors while also supporting Psychologists Off the Clock. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. When I open the Tuscan Blend Bistro Bowl meal mixer to add to Tilly and Hazel's food, they start wildly sniffing and can't wait to dig in. The best part is Whole Life Pet uses a freeze-dried process that locks in nutrients and freshness, and they never add chemicals, additives, preservatives, or anything artificial. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. If you're unsure about what to try, you can fill out their short questionnaire by clicking the red Start Today button on the home page. It will ask you a few questions and make custom product recommendations for your pets. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off today.
So I want to get a little bit into the details of time and using time here. And I think, you've mentioned you have a 5-year-old son. You're creative and prolific in your writing and your world of ideas. And you also have some hobbies. And I'm sure you have daily stuff that we all have to deal with, emails and laundry. How do you, as, a busy person, if you were to think about the typical day in your life, right? Like today or tomorrow, how do you approach sorting through all this and kind of like, creating a day for yourself?
Yeah, well, I love talking about this, so stop me if I go on too much. And I can't use today or yesterday because my wife is away for 5 nights, and I'm instantly stunned by the fact that anyone is ever a single parent, and just like filled with admiration for anyone who manages to be a single parent and do anything else at all. So it's not a very typical time because my standards for what I'm going to do, apart from a little bit of work in the middle of the day and parenting, are out the window as I do it all myself instead of as a shared burden. But one of the things I've really benefited from in terms of work is to be very sort of modest in terms of the number of hours I'm going to expect of myself to do hard, focused brain work. And here I draw partly on the work of our mutual friend Yael, Alex Pang, who in his book Rest has gone into great detail about this mysterious regularity that so many kind of authors and artists, scientists, mathematicians through history, when you look at their daily routines, were not ever trying to do more than about 4 hours of really focused, intense brain work. And I try to take that kind of approach to writing, because then what you do is you really fight quite hard to ring fence. If you're me, you fight quite hard to ring fence that time. But in return, you kind of don't try at all about the rest of it. And you don't worry about the fact that the rest of it is scattered, has lots of interruptions. So, on a typical day, I'm trying really hard to, have as few appointments before about midday as I can. But then I'm not trying to be a recluse the rest of the time. It's great to talk to people, and I wouldn't want to be a recluse, but it's that sort of, it's a very sort of limited period. And, it turns out that even if I had 8 hours to focus on writing, I wouldn't actually use those 8 hours because I would be sort of exhausted by the effort for that time. And then, I suppose I do try also to lowball the number of other things that I think I'm going to tick off any list in the course of a day, so that you get that satisfaction of having actually done the things you aim to do instead of 10% of the things that you aim to do. I think, working from home and being parent of a small child and all the rest of it, one of the things that I have definitely struggled with is how you plan the day when you don't want to create a sort of overly brittle or rigid plan. You don't want, I don't want it to be a failure of my day if it turns out that it's best for me to now spend an hour with my son talking about all the things he did at school. Like, something's gone wrong with the planning if my system is like, oh, well, today didn't work because that thing happened. You need boundaries, you need arrangements with your spouse so that it all can be as balanced and fair as possible and all the rest of it. But you don't want to create these sort of boundaries that are so firm that life keeps sort of banging into them in unhelpful ways.
Yeah, so this kind of fits in with the concept of psychological flexibility. So you try to set some boundaries, but also to kind of roll with it when the plans get overturned because you have a 5-year-old and a wife who might have other things that need to happen that
Right.
need accommodation by your schedule. But it does sound like you try hard to adopt that 4-hour a day of deep work and be as dedicated as you can, sort of within reasonable limits, which I think is brilliant. And then it really does kind of free you up to be more relaxed in the non-deep work time. So I think it's a really great take-home tip. I had a follow-up question. I was listening to another interview with you, and I think it was with Dan Harris on 10% Happier, and you talked about meditating every day. And I'm just curious how you fit that in. Maybe not in the past 5 days, but generally.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, that was a long time ago that I recorded that podcast, and I do not currently meditate as regularly or for as long as I did when I did that podcast. So the answer is I don't fit it in. I do try very hard to make space for things that sort of fit into that category for me of activity. So something that I do pretty much every day is get up early enough to do a sort of 40-minute morning pages, writing on journaling on sort of 3 sides of a narrow ruled A5 notebook, that's which takes me about 40 minutes. So again, not every single day, but that's something that I think is related. It has some of the same. It's giving some of the same benefits of meditation. And since we moved from Brooklyn to here in the Yorkshire countryside, I'm also trying really hard to make sure that I'm outdoors for an hour at least every day. Sometimes sort of running and strenuously exercising, but sometimes just sort of wandering around. Sometimes with the family. Sometimes it has to come out of my work day. That again, I think, is fulfilling some of the same purposes, and is just kind of the difference that it makes is just enormous. So some of those you do just have to be like, this is too important. I'm going to make it work, and something's going to have to give. And then others of them, as with the 45 minutes of meditation or whatever that I was doing when I did that podcast, they do give for a while, and fair enough, I suppose.
Yeah, there's phases of life, but it sort of sounds like there's a few different pockets of things that you try to accomplish in a given day. Some deep work, some time with your family, and then some time that's either meditative in nature, whether that's journaling or time outside. And Debbie and I both found quite a lot of delight in reading about this idea of the importance of hobbies and your example of Rod Stewart. And so I wonder if you can talk about the importance of non-productive hobbies and maybe, we can think about what pocket that category of activity fits into.
Yeah. I think the thing about hobbies above all is that it's this idea of doing things for themselves and not always having an instrumental goal behind what you're doing. It absolutely doesn't have to be a hobby, but I think that hobbies are a really interesting phenomenon because they're sort of frowned upon in a way almost today, right? Or sneered at or something. It's a bit embarrassing to sort of admit that you spend a significant amount of your time doing the things that we classify as hobbies. And I make the point in the book that, if it's a side hustle because you're making money out of it, then it's kind of cool. But if you're just doing it for itself, then it's a little bit embarrassing. Rod Stewart has this model railway hobby where he's a sort of internationally known rock star, but apparently all the way through this career was like building this intricate layout of an American city with model railways in it, and it's so unrelated to his personal brand that you have to conclude he must just do it because he really loves it. And I think there's something in that idea that we should all have something like that. Now, in terms of my regular day, I mean, probably the bit about walking and hiking is what I'm doing in that respect. I am not currently also finding time to build an enormous miniature railway setup.
Or tickle the keys, right?
Right. Well, I do also mention, yes, playing the piano badly. And I mention that partly because I think it's actually sometimes quite helpful if the hobby you have is something you're really mediocre at. I get some time to do that, maybe just 10 minutes in a work break or something. But what's so freeing about that is that there's no pressure, right? Because I am never going to earn $1 for my piano playing, guaranteed. Unless I go somewhere public and take money to stop playing or something, So there's none of that pressure that I do feel with writing and with all my sort of main work operations, which is that you want to do them well and they might not work out. And so the pressure is there. And with a few sort of hobbies where that just doesn't matter, I think are an incredibly important thing to have in the midst of a life.
You break a bunch of myths in your book about how we get trapped into thinking about time in unhelpful ways. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love that you talk about is this idea of our focus on the importance of freedom in how we choose our time. So, we want to be able to choose, how we structure our day, how much time we spend on work versus how much time we spend with our families, when we wake up, when we go to bed. Yet total freedom over time, you talk about, has some costs that might be surprising, where constraints might actually help us out in surprising ways. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the costs of free time and how we might newly see the positive value of time that's not freely spent.
Yeah, I think the kind of freedom that we're talking about here is that individual freedom, isn't it? It's that idea that you may have all sorts of constraints on your time, but the ideal that we seem to reinforce as a culture is that in the perfect world, you would get up in the morning and it would be completely up to you what you did with your time. And, maybe some of that would absolutely be spent communally, but nonetheless, you would get to decide, exactly when you did things. And the sort of epitome of this these days is the notion of the digital nomad, right? The person who can just sort of work from wherever they want with their laptop and is unconstrained by any kind of limitations on their time. And what you find if you talk to those people is that there are advantages to that lifestyle, but it can be really lonely as well, because actually an awful lot of the benefit that we get from how we spend our time is in the way it's coordinated with other people, and it's to do with rituals and traditions and ways of doing things that line up our time with other people, so that we can use it like this. You find in countries where they have a very strong social, maybe even legal norm of summer vacations all be taken at the same point, that there's a big happiness benefit to this out in the world, because people are happier when they're on vacation at the same time as lots of other people, because you get to hang out with the people that you want to see, or because that no one's trying to steal your job behind your back and the emails aren't flooding in. And in these very little ways that we don't think about, right? I mean, if we didn't have those rhythms at all, we wouldn't be able to do all the things that give us value, whether it's in work or relationships or activism or anything else. It requires that coordination of time. So yeah, if you end up, one thing I find as a sort of a freelance laptop-y person, right, is I have total control over my schedule in some ways, and so do quite a lot of my friends. It's impossible to find a place in our diaries to meet up, when we're all free to meet up, because we're all out of sync with each other, because we all have this degree of control. And the best times are when you sort of, you start a book club, or you join a society, or until COVID anyway, used to sing in a choir all the time, where you give up that right. It's like, no, it's Wednesdays at 7:00. That's when it happens. And if you want to be part of this, that's when you have to do it. And you have to work with that and fit your schedule around it. And that's what enables the fact that this great thing can happen. So yeah, that's all I'm
Yeah, it reminds
saying
me
there.
of the research from Émile Durkheim, who was a French sociologist, and he published this study on suicide, looking at predictors of suicide. And what he found was that no matter how he categorized, he collected data from across Europe and found that people with more role constraints, who had more demands, more obligations, were less likely to commit suicide. So you're kind of getting at it from a different angle, but it's this idea that when we're sort of constrained in these ways because of ties to other people, it is a loss of freedom, but it's a gain of connection and meaning because we're doing things with and for, in service, or just connecting in the joy together with other people. And there's something that's a human need that we have that is hard to fulfill if we don't have those kinds of constraints or obligations.
Yeah, right. We're sort of held in that web and supported by it as well. And, it's definitely, there's ambivalence here, because you wouldn't want to belong. A society that schedules all of its people's time all the time is a totalitarian one by definition. And, there's certainly been times and places in history when people have sort of suffered under having their time controlled far too much for them, or by societal norms or whatever it might be. But you don't want to assume that this sort of ultra-libertarian alternative is actually where you should be headed. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind if you're someone who does have freedom over your schedule, or is seeking to increase the level of freedom you have over your schedule. It's like there's a flip side to this as well.
Okay, so since we have you here for a few more minutes, I want to ask you some advice for my life, okay? Because you've alluded to this a couple times today and in your book. I always think I'm right around the corner from being caught up on things, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as I get this deadline that I have on Friday and I finish these couple of things that are hanging, then I'm going to have more spaciousness in my schedule to do these relaxing, enjoyable things. I also feel like I'm constantly, I think you call it clearing the decks. I'm trying to clear the desks on certain right? I never catch up on my emails. I'm always a little behind on my therapy notes. Sometimes a lot behind on my therapy notes. I'm never caught up with laundry. So it's like I'm trying to get ahead of the game with these big items on my to-do list. And then I'm trying to, as soon as I'm folded all the laundry and I've caught up on my notes, then I'm going to chill out. What advice do you have? And I talk to therapy clients all the time who struggle with this same thing, this sense of like, I'm almost there. And if I just push through, but of course, right? So what advice do you have for me?
I feel a little conflicted, because I still totally get into that mindset, right? I don't want anyone to think, listening to this, that
you haven't totally sort of mastered it yourself.
Have it all nailed. Okay. What really helps, there's an attitudinal point and then there's a tactical point, I suppose. The attitudinal point is just that what has changed for me is that I can sort of see through this a bit, even while it is descending upon me, right? So there's a kind of disillusionment in a positive sense that has happened for me, so that, sure, maybe in the back of my mind while I'm going through my email is the notion that I'm going to get on top of it all forever. But I can also sort of see a little bit that that's just my same old stuff doing its thing, and I know what's going on there. So in a way, you can just become a little bit more sort of accepting of your own ridiculousness in that respect, and then you can sort of take the edge off it that causes the stress, right? Because it's not a problem to be entertaining that slight daydream that you're about to be on top of everything, unless it's kind of causing you suffering that it doesn't need to cause, or causing you to sort of distort your priorities in a way that you otherwise wouldn't. And then tactically, I kind of find that this sort of what I call, and has been called by others, sort of a fixed volume approach to productivity is really helpful here. So if you tell yourself today is the day I get through my inbox, then you're really just sort of exacerbating that mindset. If you say, today at this time I'll dedicate an hour to getting through my inbox, even if in that time you are still, bewitched by that fantasy of sorting it all out, that's okay, and it's got some boundaries around it, and you're going to be reminded when your timer goes off, or however you're handling this, it's time to get up and go and do the next thing. You can sort of use the energy of that the thing you're talking about without becoming totally sort of governed by it, because you're sort of putting boxes around your time. The sort of most basic level here is just you're saying, first of all, what time do I have available, and then what shall I fit into that time, rather than first of all, what tasks do I have to get through, and how the heck am I going to make sure that I get through them all by the end of the day, which is just a recipe for the planning fallacy, for vastly, insanely overestimating how much you're really going to get around to. So I'm definitely spend time doing something that I would call clearing the decks still today, but I do it for, maybe an hour and a half, and guess what? They're never clear, but that's okay.
Well, that's one of the reasons I really wanted to be involved in this interview is that this perspective shift, I've used it with a lot of clients, and also just an occasional reminder to myself since I read your book, that it is something about coming to a sense of reality, and it's not your fault for not being caught up. It's just so liberating. It's like, it's not like you're not productive enough. It's that you're trying to do something that's impossible. It's unrealistic. Yes. And so you actually have to just kind of like find a little bit of peace with that, to let yourself off the hook and be like, maybe I'll never catch up on some of these things. Mm-hmm. That's okay. I still have to like live my life in a way that's meaningful to me. And if I'm going to be constantly behind in a few areas, okay.
Right. It's inevitable, and it's inevitable for everyone. And it's a function of the standards that you're holding yourself to, rather than your failure to have exerted enough self-discipline. Yeah.
Well, Oliver, thank you for spending one of your 4,000 some odd mortal hours with us. We were honored and just delighted to steal an hour of your time. And we will definitely link to your website. Are there other places that listeners can find out more about you and your work?
Well, the book is finally now back in stock. Pretty much all the places books are sold, and obviously ebook and audiobook have always been there all along. And no, my website oliverburkeman.com is where to find everything else. Sign up for the newsletter and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for your questions and the conversation.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with us on social media and purchase swag from our merch store by going to our website at offtheclockpsych.com/merch.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, our dissemination coordinator, Katie Rothfelder, and our editorial coordinator, Melissa Miller.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.